As it is believed the energy of beings is cyclical, passing to another body once the host has died, the world has existed forever, created by no one. Yet, in the savannah there was a baobab tree. One day, this tree began to crack. This fissure would spread across the trunk of the baobab, and soon an arm began slipping out. From this tree sprang the first man, who would be the father of all mankind. Chad was the perfect cradle for civilization, with a large lake providing water, and many rivers branching off for transportation. So, it is no surprise that the South civilization flourished around the Chari River. Yet, since the civilization more likely based transfer of information through word of mouth, there is not much known about them. What we do know is from outside sources, who describe their societies as hierarchical with fortified towns. These towns worked as a sort of city-state, which were united by common culture and language. Which outside source do we get this information from, you may ask yourself? Well, from the kingdom that conquered them, the Kanem-Bornu Empire. This state originated from the north of the Chad Lake, as the center of a network of trade routes between Mali, Egypt, and many other nations. But we'll save their origins for the history of Nigeria. The Kanem-Bornu were a Muslim nation, and began to expand southwards, warring with the South city-states. They declared these wars on the basis of jihad and the South rejection of Islam. Then, they founded the city of Njimi, which quickly became a vital trading hub, and subsequently the capital of the Kanem-Bornu Empire. This empire dealt with constant border wars with neighboring tribes due to their aggressive expansion. The Bilala, or Bulala, depending on pronunciation, one of these tribes from central Chad, managed to kill 5 of the Kanem kings, sending the empire into disarray. This tribe took advantage of the confusion of succession, and was able to push the empire out of Chadian lands, and from the entire Kanem part of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, making them change their name to simply Bornu. Once established in Kanem, these people formed their own sultanate of Yao, but very soon after a war was declared by the Bornu and by the Bagirimi, a new nation to the south that emerged from a nomadic tribe. This duo of empires pushed the Bilala from Kanem into their former homelands to the east. As Muslim people began to expand into North Africa, many also settled in West Chad in towns spread across the region, where Tunju people had a kingdom. Eventually, allying with the local people, the Muslims overthrew the Tunju and formed their own empire of Wadai or Burdu, depending on who you ask. For our sake, we'll call them the Wadai to avoid confusion between the Bornu and the Burdu. The Bagirimi were plagued with drought and many diseases, and were left very vulnerable to attacks. This is why the Bornu attacked and conquered this nation fairly easily. This caused the further decline of the nation, as they were forced to pay tribute to the Bornu and slaves. So, the Bagirimi raided towns in their own borders for tribute to the Bornu. This wasn't the last of the horrid era for the Bagirimi, as they were subsequently conquered by the Wadai, this time becoming a part of the kingdom, rather than a tributary state like the previous rulers. The Wadai continued conquering small tribes surrounding them, but never fought the Bornu. The Bornu also saw a period of expansion, gaining territories in modern-day northern Nigeria. And, to secure their expansive borders, the Bornu built fortified outposts near the edges of their empire, and along trade routes as a deterrent against robbers. But all good things must come to an end as independent states began breaking off from the Bornu Empire, and infighting started in attempts to expand personal wealth and power in controlling trade routes. Soon, the Sokoto Empire declared war on the Bornu in their weak state. But, in the first battle, the Sokoto suffered heavy losses and retreated. The Bornu forces marched into Sokoto lands, but were slowly picked off due to guerrilla tactics. This sent the empire into retreat, and by the end of the war, the Bornu lost vital slave-capturing territories, further crippling the nation. Central African traders primarily profited off of the slave trade, as it was in high demand in European and North African nations. On top of this, the Bornu Empire had a direct route to Tripoli, the largest Mediterranean market for slaves. Chadians didn't have access to gold like the West Africans, or access to India like the East Africans, and so didn't capture the attention of colonizers, which allowed them to stay under the radar for a while. But, very soon European explorers began visiting and establishing trade relations, such as Heinrich Barth, who visited the Bornu Empire, documenting their culture and history. During this time, Chadian nations began trade relations with Europeans directly, rather than through a middleman. But, due to this, these nations caught the eye of the French, who were looking to expand their empire, and connecting their holdings in Djibouti to their territories in Senegal by railway. Now, a man fleeing English persecution settled south of Wadai with hundreds of his followers, and he kept gaining these followers by raiding nearby towns and offering slaves and prisoners freedom if they joined him. His name was Rabih Al-Zubayr. Al-Zubayr began assembling immense power, and even allied with a local kingdom. This scared the French, who wanted this land, and hoped to take it relatively easily without a fight. Also, by this time, the Baguirimi became independent, and a protectorate of the French, in an attempt to stay safe surrounded by hostile kingdoms. This angered Al-Zubayr, seeing as they betrayed Africa by allying with Europeans. Al-Zubayr attacked but never conquered, out of the fear of provoking war with the French. He did destroy the Baguirimi capital so horribly that the state needed to move their capital to a new town. Attacking the country obviously further angered the French, who already disliked the man. Once Al-Zubayr was home, he plotted and deployed for his next attack on the Bornu Empire. He declared war, and on his way to the capital, his army clashed with the Bornu army, defeating them. This resulted in the capture of the Bornu Sultan. Many things just fell into place after this victory, as in a very short time there were several military successes, and the capital gave in to the army's might. But, in response to the resistance, the capital was sacked and razed. Al-Zubayr conquered the whole of the Bornu Empire, and incorporated these lands into his own. But, soon after, he wanted more modern guns to give to his army. He tried to trade with the British, but they obviously turned him down, not wanting an African nation gaining power. Now, Rabih al-Zubayr met with a French explorer that was passing through his empire, and when the explorer refused to sell the empire his modern rifles, the explorer was imprisoned. This was the perfect excuse the French were looking for to invade, which they promptly did. But the first battle between the armies led to a French defeat, and a death of a prominent officer due to overwhelming numbers. Now the French were livid, so 3 armies, one from Gabon, one from Nigeria, and another from Algeria, began marching on the country. These armies met together after conquering the town of Kuseri. The French easily conquered the nation and killed Al-Zubayr, parading his head on a pike after victory. Now, finally, the French owned Central Africa, as they had hoped for so long. The area of Chad was placed in the grouping of territories called French Equatorial Africa. And yet, although the French wanted the land so badly, they didn't do much with Chad other than collect cotton and manpower from the local people. This loose grip on a land mostly overlooked made it a perfect place for a culture of bandits to form, and for many small pockets of African resistance to colonialism to flourish. Chad became a sort of Wild West of Africa. This also allowed for many Chadians to avoid fighting in World War I, but some still left their homes. And after the war, Chad was given its own colonial administration. Still, not much happened other than some tighter restriction in the south. World War II was a different story entirely, as once France capitulated to Germany, Free France was founded by French colonies in Africa, and Chad was one of the first to join this resistance nation. Chadians made a large part of an invasion force that attacked Italian colonial holdings in Libya from the south, across the Sahara, and afterwards would fight to liberate Tunisia. These men fighting was one of the best things to happen to French Chad, as, once the war was over, the soldiers were given pensions and other benefits by the French government. In a new bill, French colonial holdings were given more autonomy, and given their own government. Yet, unreasonable quotas were placed on Chadian cotton farmers, and this cotton was in turn sold at abysmally low prices. But what pushed the idea of Chadian sovereignty was France negotiating with Italy a portion of land known as the Azu Strip to be given to Libya. These negotiations went on without consulting the people or the colonial government, which angered the locals, who told their rulers they wanted out. To their surprise, the French agreed. No fighting needed. This first independent government was an authoritarian regime, and very soon after this government rose to power, it banned any opposition parties, and the leader went on an arresting spree, imprisoning many politically involved individuals. Eventually, a group from central Chad revolted. These people felt that the government abused its power, and felt that the Muslim beliefs were not represented by their Christian rulers. They clashed with the army, and the revolt was violently crushed, leaving around 500 Chadians dead. The nation's people watched this brutality in horror, and were angered by the government's response. So, there was the Chad Liberation Front that was founded soon after, which amassed an army that sent the nation into civil war. The Chadian government received aid from France and troops, and from Libya and tighter border control, since Libya was where the rebels received their supplies from. Despite these advantages, the Chadian leader began acting in many increasingly brutal ways, which thinned the support that he had, and in turn limited his power, which resulted in a Chadian Liberation Party victory. The popularity of this party didn't last long, as the support for the Liberation Front was in opposition to authoritarianism, but once the party overthrew the government, they became the exact thing that they sought to destroy. This began another civil war. The war was brutal, but wrapped up with peace talks held by the Organization of African Unity, where the various factions fighting agreed to a transitional government. But this government was filled with distrust, and the civil war reignited when one faction began marching its army on another. At this point, Libya, led by Muammar Gaddafi, involved itself militarily in the conflict, heavily in support of the rebel faction, and, seeing an opportunity, used the chaos of civil war to occupy northern Chad. Most importantly, the Aouzou Strip, which angered many Chadians. Although, public outrage was increased when the Chadian Prime Minister signed a treaty with Libya, giving the nation control of the Aouzou Strip. In return, the Libyans would stop their support of the rebel faction in the north. Partially due to this, and for the lack of action in dealing with a civil war, the president was ousted by the military and replaced with a new, less Libyan supportive leader. This angered Gaddafi, and he began resupplying the northern rebels. And eventually, alongside the rebels, Libyan forces invaded Chad. This invasion was brought before the UN, and many nations supported the Chadian government. The most important of these being France. France sent troops to support Chad, which were able to stop an attack headed directly towards N'Djamena, the capital. Following this, the Chadian rebel and Libyan ties began to weaken, and their leader, Gokuni, was nearly assassinated by Gaddafi and his men. Libyan relations devolved to the point that the civil war ends and peace talks begin between the two sides, and the rebel leader Gokuni is made leader of Chad. This moment of peace was halted by another civil war, where the supposedly anti-Libyan leader Gokuni proposed a union between Chad and Libya to form one massive African nation. And so, Libyan troops occupied most of the country. There was severe external pressure from France and many African nations, leading to Gokuni demanding Libyan troops leave Chad. This not only was agreed to by Gaddafi, but surprisingly happened without bloodshed. And now an international peacekeeping force was sent to Chad in prevention of further war. Now, without the support of Libya, the Chadian government was severely weakened, and a rebel faction deposed the partially Libyan supporting leader Gokuni, and instated Hissène Habré as the Chadian leader. This angered Gaddafi, and he began another Chadian invasion from the north. This began a new wave of anti-Libyan support from France, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the USA in the form of arms, soldiers, and funding. The Libyan army allied themselves with a local rebel group, but a stalemate was reached, and this saw a period of major desertion from the Libyan-supported soldiers. During this time, the French Air Force played a vital role in damaging rebel infrastructure. The rebel faction almost entirely defected to help the Chadian government against the Libyans. Now, for the first time in many years, the Chadians fought together against a common enemy. And this new influx of troops helped Chadians make territorial gains, ending in the full expulsion of Libyans from Chad. In the end, Chad regained control of the Aouzou Strip, and the government of Chad remained in power, with some negotiations between the rebels and the Chadian state. One of the biggest changes brought to the nation was multi-party elections. Two Chadian rebel groups, the SCUD and the RDL, stationed in Sudan, attacked the town of Adri. This wasn't taken well by the Chadian government, as the president exclaimed, "The attack at Adra, perpetrated by the Khartoum regime, is to destabilize our country, to drive our people into misery, to create disorder, and export the war from Darfur to Chad." That's the plan that President al-Bashir nourishes. Sudan was thrown blame for the attack, which led to a war between the nations, which is also a civil war due to the Chadian rebel groups conducting the attack. Following this declaration of war, the rebel groups took control of several towns. Once again, the French became involved, supporting the Chadian government by sending troops. The rebels assembled a force and began sieging the Chadian capital. This siege was soon broken, and the rebels were met with a swift defeat. And soon after, Chad signed a peace deal with Sudan. There was a coup planned to take down the Chadian president for extending his term as president indefinitely. But this was crushed, and the same man has remained in power to this day. And that is the state of the nation of Chad.